In the late 1930s in Paris, Citroen engineers were designing a revolutionary automobile. However, this vehicle would hit the market 10 years later than originally planned. Because during those intervening 10 years, prototypes were buried in forests, hidden in barns, and kept from the eyes of Nazi Germany. This is not just the story of an automobile, but also a tale of survival, resistance, and faith in a vision. In 1930s, France, the rural population had a major problem: transportation. Farmers still worked with horse-drawn carriages, and the gap between them and city dwellers widened with each passing day. Pierre-Jules Boulanger, Citroën's president at the time, decided to find a solution to this problem. Boulanger wasn't just a businessman, he was a social visionary. During his travels to rural France in 1933, he closely observed the living conditions of farmers. He saw the difficulty farmers had transporting their products to market, that doctors couldn't reach villages, and that children walked kilometers to get to school. These observations sparked a revolution in his mind. Boulanger's vision was clear: to motorize the French peasant. However, this wouldn't be a luxury automobile, but an extremely practical and economical vehicle. The instructions he gave to his engineers became legendary. Build me a car that can fit under a hat, carry a basket full of eggs across a muddy field without breaking them, and consume 3 liters per 100 kilometers. And also, it should have a washable interior that a farmer can get into with dirty boots. These demands seemed nearly impossible for that era. Citroën was already a brand known for technical innovations. In 1934, they had launched the groundbreaking traction Avant. But the TPV project was an entirely different challenge. The team, led by chief engineer André Lefebvre and Italian designer Flaminio Bertoni, got to work. Lefebvre, with his background in aeronautical engineering, knew the importance of weight reduction. Every gram mattered. Bertoni, meanwhile, was a genius at combining form and function. The resulting design was radically simple and functional: a lightweight body, minimalist interior, extraordinary suspension system, and a small but efficient engine. The suspension system was particularly revolutionary. Thanks to long coil springs, the vehicle could maintain passenger comfort on almost any terrain. The first prototypes were incredibly light, only 300 kilograms. The engine power was modest, just 9 horsepower. But the goal wasn't speed, but economy and practicality. And indeed, the first tests were amazing. The car consumed 3 liters per 100 kilometers, could reach 60 kilometers per hour, and most importantly, could carry a basket full of eggs across a muddy field without breaking them. By 1939, 250 prototypes, called TPV, Très Petite Voiture, very small car, were ready. Intensive testing had been done. The cars had been tried and improved in France's mountainous regions, muddy village roads, and all kinds of weather conditions. The launch date was set: October 1939, Paris Auto Show. However, history had other plans. On September 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. 2 days later, France and Britain declared war on Germany. The Paris Auto Show was cancelled. Citroën's revolutionary automobile was buried in a dark period of history before it could meet the world. In the first months, the phony war period occurred. There were no major clashes on the front, but Citroën management understood the seriousness of the situation. Factories were already preparing to switch to military production. A civilian project like the TPV was no longer a priority. In May 1940, Germany launched a major attack on France. Blitzkrieg, lightning war tactics shattered the French defensive lines. In just 6 weeks, the French army, once considered the world's most powerful, collapsed. On June 14th, the Germans entered Paris. On June 22nd, France surrendered and the country was divided in two. The north fell under occupation, while the Vichy government was established in the south. Nazi Germany followed a policy of using industrial facilities in occupied countries for its own war machine. Automobile factories were forced into military vehicle production. Technologies were confiscated. Renault, Peugeot, Citroen all had to serve the German war effort. Pierre Boulanger faced a tremendous dilemma. On one hand, he had to keep his factory running and provide for thousands of workers. On the other hand, he was forced to collaborate with the Nazi regime. But he was determined about one thing. TPV technology would not be handed over to the Germans. Boulanger and his team knew very well what would happen if the TPV prototypes fell into German hands. Either the technology would be used in German war industry, perhaps to produce light military vehicles, or it would simply be destroyed. Both scenarios were unacceptable. 10 years of work, the vision for the future had to be protected. And so began one of the most extraordinary covert operations in engineering history. Just before the Germans entered Paris, during the chaotic days of June 1940, a secret flurry of activity began at the Citroen factory. This wasn't panic, it was a carefully planned operation. Of the 250 TPV prototypes, only 3 or 4 were left at the factory, and even these were deliberately dismantled and rendered useless. Engine parts were removed, critical components broken. If the Germans examined these vehicles, they would see only a failed prototype. The fate of the remaining vehicles was much more interesting. Boulanger worked with a few trusted individuals. Each received different assignments and knew only their own task. This way, even if someone was caught and interrogated, they couldn't expose the entire operation. The fate of some prototypes was almost cinematic. They were taken to the Fontainebleau forests around Paris and other woodland areas. Engineers and trusted workers transported these cars by truck in the darkness of night. Deep pits were dug, sometimes 3 meters deep. The cars were carefully placed inside and covered with soil, leaves, and branches. Some were wrapped in waterproof wax tarps to protect them from moisture. Engines and sensitive parts were greased and specially protected. Other prototypes were hidden in the barns of trusted farmers in rural areas, hidden among hay bales in remote farms in Brittany, Normandy, and the Loire Valley. These vehicles would remain there for 4 years. Some were stored in distant relatives' garages, some in abandoned barns, and some in specially constructed secret rooms, behind walls or in underground cellars. A group of prototypes was moved further south to Vichy, France. This unoccupied region was relatively safer, though the Vichy regime also collaborated with Nazi Germany. Still, the risk was lower. Most critical was the technical documentation. All drawings, calculations, test results, patent applications, everything that could be considered the DNA of the TPV, were moved to safe locations. Some documents were smuggled to Switzerland and stored in safety deposit boxes at banks through Citroen's connections there. Some were hidden in specially made secret compartments within the factory, in metal boxes embedded in walls. Some important drawings were divided into multiple copies and distributed to different locations, so that even if one place was discovered, all the information wouldn't be lost. Boulanger also protected critical engineers. Some key employees were transferred to rural areas, officially for different assignments. In reality, they were being kept away from German attention. Some were sent to other cities with false identities. But the biggest danger was information leakage. The fewer people who knew about these hiding places, the better. Boulanger worked with a small trusted team. Only a few people knew the location of each hiding place. In fact, in some cases, one person knew the location of only one place. Even if one place was discovered, the others would remain safe. And the most impressive part, the Germans never suspected. The Citroen factory produced trucks and military vehicle parts for the Germans throughout the occupation years, but they remained unaware of the TPV's existence. A secret resistance was taking place right under the occupiers' nose. Boulanger skillfully played a double game, outwardly an obedient collaborator, secretly a resistor protecting French industrial heritage. Between 1940 and 1944, the TPV project seemed almost forgotten. The world was on fire, millions were dying, cities were being reduced to rubble. But Boulanger and his small team never gave up on their vision. Life under occupation in France was hard. Scarcity, oppression, and fear were everywhere. Gasoline, rubber, metal, everything was rationed. People were starving. The Gestapo was everywhere. People were arrested on suspicion, tortured, and deported. In this environment, thinking about an automobile project could seem like a luxury, even madness. But the engineers continued to work in secret. In their homes, behind closed doors, they improved the design on paper. They made production plans for the post-war period. They thought about which materials would be available and what alternatives could be used instead. Because they knew that post-war France would be destroyed and poor, the TPV had to be even simpler and cheaper. The risk was great. Being accused of sabotage or resistance could mean the death penalty. But Boulanger was careful. While collaborating with the Germans at the factory, producing trucks, ambulances, military vehicle parts, he was secretly making plans for the future. In 1944, Pierre Boulanger tragically lost his life. On November 11th, while traveling in a Citroen traction avant that he was driving himself, he collided with a truck and died. According to official records, it was a traffic accident. However, some thought it wasn't a real accident. Boulanger was known as someone who refused to fully cooperate with the Germans during the occupation years, who tried to protect his workers, and who slowed down production. Some historians suggested it might have been an assassination targeting an industrialist who refused to collaborate. The truth was never definitively known. However, Boulanger's legacy lived on. His successor, Pierre Bercot, believed in the TPV vision. He was one of the few people aware of the project. And when the war ended, he was determined to bring this project to life. In August 1944, the Allies landed in Normandy. In September, Paris was liberated. The German occupation was over. France was free, but devastated. Cities had been bombed, infrastructure destroyed. The economy collapsed. Millions of people were displaced. Poverty and hunger prevailed. But now there was a new problem. The prototypes were still underground, in barns. And they had been exposed to natural conditions for 4 years. Were they still usable? When the war ended, the Great Search began. Maps were pulled out. Memories were refreshed. Trusted men were sent to the old hiding places. But some places had been forgotten. Some people had died in the war, and only they knew the locations of hiding places. Some farms had been bombed. Some farmers had migrated. Finding the cars in the forests was the hardest. In 4 years, the landscape had changed. Trees had grown, vegetation had changed. In some places, engineers searched for days. Finally, they reached the vehicles by noticing subsidence in the soil and different color tones. When the cars in the forests were found, the scene that emerged was both sad and hopeful. Some cars had been damaged by moisture, engine parts had rusted, tires had rotted. In some places where water had leaked, interiors had molded, cables had decayed. But the basic structure was still intact. The light but solid chassis had been incredibly well preserved. The spring mechanism of the suspension system was still operational thanks to lubrication. The prototypes in the barns were generally in better condition. The dry environment had protected the vehicles. Some became operational after just light cleaning, lubrication, and maintenance. One prototype, found on a farm in Brittany, was in almost perfect condition, as if it had been parked yesterday. In total, about 5 to 6 prototypes were recovered in good condition. The others were used as part sources. Every recovered car was like a victory. Most importantly, the technical documents were recovered almost completely. The safes in Switzerland were opened. The secret compartments in the factory were revealed. 10 years of engineering work had survived the Nazi destruction. In 1945, Citroen's new management decided to continue the project. But this wasn't an easy decision. France was devastated, resources were scarce. Other automakers were planning bigger, more luxurious cars. But Citroën thought differently. What post-war France needed was exactly like the TPV, a cheap, economical, practical vehicle. However, this was no longer the pre-war TPV. The world had changed, needs had changed, materials had changed. The design was reviewed and modernized. The most important change was in the engine system. The original design was water-cooled. The new version switched to an air-cooled system, simpler, cheaper, requiring less maintenance. Engine power was increased from 9 to 12 horsepower. Still modest, but slightly more adequate. The body also changed. The original prototypes were made from a light aluminum cardboard mixture. The new version had a more durable, wave-shaped metal body, the famous corrugated design. This was both light and increased structural strength. The interior was simplified even further. The original idea of a washable interior was preserved, so farmers could get in with muddy boots. The fabric on the seats was removable and could be hosed down. The suspension system was improved. The long coil springs were further optimized. The car provided an incredibly smooth ride. A basket full of eggs still wouldn't break. Between 1946 and 1948, intensive testing was conducted. Prototypes were tested in every corner of France, in the Alps, in the heat of Provence, on the rainy roads of Brittany. Each test improved the design. Finally, on October 7, 1948, exactly 9 years late, it met the world at the Paris Auto Show. The Citroën 2CV, 2 chevaux, 2 horses. Initial reactions were surprisingly mixed. The press was merciless. One magazine called it a four-wheeled umbrella. Another critic wrote, "Wheels on a tin can." It was found unconventional, even ugly. As luxurious American cars became fashionable in post-war Europe, the 2CV seemed almost comical. But the public thought differently. On the first day of launch, 5,000 orders were taken. By the end of the first year, the waiting list was 3 years. Some people waited 5 to 6 years to get their cars. Because the 2CV did exactly what it promised. It was cheap, durable, consumed incredibly little fuel, and moved like a tank on the muddy roads of the French countryside. It was a revolution for French farmers. Now they could easily transport their products to market. Doctors could reach villages. Families could go on weekend trips. The 2CV wasn't just a means of transportation, it was a tool for social mobility. Over time, the 2CV gained cult status. For generations, it became a symbol of France. Students, artists, intellectuals used the 2CV. The car's simplicity and austerity became a life philosophy. When production stopped in 1990, a total of 3.8 million units had been sold, not just in France, but worldwide. It was produced in factories from Portugal to Argentina, from Iran to Chile. Today, the 2CV is still a favorite among classic car enthusiasts. Well-preserved examples sell for high prices. 2CV festivals organized worldwide every year bring together thousands of enthusiasts. So what happened to those original prototypes hidden during the war? Several of the recovered prototypes were preserved in Citroen's collection. Today, at Citroen's Conservatoire Museum near Paris, you can see some of those buried cars. After years underground, they were restored and are now displayed as witnesses to automotive history. Some prototypes are in the hands of private collectors. In the post-war years, some engineers remembered hiding places and recovered cars on their own. These cars today reach dizzying prices at auctions, not just for their historical value, but for that incredible survival story. Interestingly, a still-buried prototype was found in a forest in the 1990s. A local historian learned of the hiding place while collecting memories of former Citroen employees. When excavated 50 years later, a TPV prototype emerged, rusty but recognizable. This car wasn't restored. It was preserved as is, bearing the marks of time and history.